big national security and economic developments in our world. Their governments, Russia and China's, are united in putting up barriers to American values and our products. Since Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, the United States and our allies have hit Russia, Putin, and the oligarchs with the most powerful sanctions in history. It's not just about yanking away super yachts and private jets. Putin is now the head of a pariah state. The Senate and my colleague, Senator Crapo, and I, the ranking member, are working very hard to formally designate Russia as a pariah state by revoking permanent normal trade relations. Our country is showing Russia that taking this abusive, totalitarian road is a bad bet. The United States and our allies must prove the same to China. China's government is a human rights abusing, jobs and tech stealing behemoth, and the government is the head of this economic superpower. One of my top concerns about the Chinese government's economic model is censorship. When the internet took off, America's innovators were first out of the gate with big ideas. The Chinese government responded by using the Great Firewall to block those companies and allowed Chinese firms to rip off their ideas. Even worse, Chinese tech comes with Chinese censorship, and China censors the American people and our businesses as well. The China model of censorship is now popping up all over the world. It fractures the internet, and it certainly is something we see in Russia, where the people are being fed lies about what's going on in the Ukraine. The United States has to stand up to this kind of censorship, and USTR has a big role in fighting for a free and open internet through smart digital trade policy. The Chinese government obviously wants to dominate the technologies that'll dominate the rest of the 21st century, such as semiconductors, EV batteries, and artificial intelligence. It continues its horrendous record of abusing human rights and trampling on workers. Again, this is where USTR comes in. USTR has a responsibility to take on China's anti-competitive and anti-freedom practices, and we are going to be working closely with them as they do. The United States and our allies have recently shown with Russian sanctions that our collective economic power is certainly anything but soft. A big reason why the United States was able to marshal such strength was because the Biden administration and the USTR has worked to mend our relationships in Europe. The United States has racked up significant wins that always are important but don't seem to get a lot of discussion. USTR finally brokered a deal in an aircraft trade dispute with the EU and the UK that had been unresolved for nearly 2 decades. USTR and the Commerce Department reached deals with the EU, the UK, and Japan on steel and aluminum, and will help us remove existing tariffs, bring down prices for Americans, and fight carbon emissions. Before resolving these disputes, American firms had been in the crossfire with tariffs on everything from airplanes to cranberries to wine. EU tariffs on distilled spirits endangered Oregon's thriving craft beverage industry. Ambassador Tai's work eliminated significant tariff threats and helped to ensure that Americans would grow good-paying jobs and more exports. Last week, USTR persuaded Japan to allow in more U.S. beef at lower tariff levels. That is big news for ranchers. In a new agreement with the EU, American fishers are exporting live oysters and clams and mussels to Europe for the first time in a decade. Resolving these issues brings the U.S. and our traditional economic allies closer together. Finally, the committee held a hearing on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is another opportunity to strengthen our economic ties and marginalize the Russia-China model. The Indo-Pacific effort is especially important to folks in our part of the world, the Pacific Northwest, because the Pacific Northwest in our country is the gateway to the Pacific. A good agreement will build overseas barriers to Oregon products from Columbia Gorge pears to Wallowa beef. Reducing barriers means better market access for farmers and manufacturers. This is so important in our state, where the trade-related jobs, as you and I have talked about, Ambassador Tai, often pay better than the non-trade jobs because there can be a higher value-added component. It's also an important opportunity to raise standards for labor rights, environmental protections, and a free and open internet. And I'm going to close with one last point that is especially important to Senator Crapo and I. This is a positive development also with respect to transparency in government. Ambassador Tai has made it clear to us that there are going to be new transparency and consultation efforts to make sure that there's a broader debate about how to get more American workers and small businesses in the winner's circle. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Our friend, Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ambassador Tai. I agree with the concerns and issues that Senator Wyden raised and the progress that he has identified. But I'm going to issue kind of a strong statement today. On your drive here, Ambassador Tai, you probably passed an inscription engraved on the National Archives that says, "Past is prologue." An enduring piece of the past wisdom is President Reagan's 1982 address to the nation on international free trade, which was founded on his personal commitment to free market principles, both at home and abroad. He explained that as Americans, we must insist on sound domestic policies at home that bring down inflation, provide opportunity for free world countries to go forward and sustain the drive toward more open markets, such as the meeting he organized in Geneva that eventually led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. And most importantly, negotiate, particularly for free trade agreements, like the United States' first two free trade agreements with Israel and Canada that were led by President Reagan's administration. President Reagan's policies helped to break inflation and restore American leadership on trade. But it seems President Biden's trade policy takes the opposite stance. At a time when inflation has soared to 7.9%, President Biden says he will not pursue trade agreements until his domestic agenda is complete. If ever enacted, this reckless spending agenda would not only make inflation worse, it would undercut U.S. leadership on trade by promoting a China-styled industrial policy. Proposed electric vehicle provisions, for example, will discriminate against 48 of the 50 models available for sale in the United States. It is no wonder why 25 foreign ambassadors told Congress these provisions breached our international trade obligations. I'm disappointed that the administration continues to pursue this agenda instead of focusing on negotiations for new trade agreements. This is a shame because the Biden administration knows better. Its 2022 trade agenda opens on the very point, and I quote, "The Biden administration recognizes that trade can and should be a force for good." Absolutely. My home state of Idaho is proof positive of that proposition. In 2019, international trade supported over 200,000 jobs in Idaho, or almost 20% of the state's employment. Trade liberalization also saves the average Idaho family of four more than $10,000 per year. The problem here is that President Biden's recognition of trade's overall importance is not matched with an agenda that contains the requisite ambition to succeed. There is not a single free trade agreement under consideration in this agenda. Free trade agreements open opportunities. We have seen it over and over, and the past really is prologue. Idaho's dairy exports to Korea increased by more than 250% since our free trade agreement entered into force in 2012. But in lieu of trade agreements, this administration is proposing dialogues and frameworks, including the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. IPEF may be a positive first step to engagement in Asia, but it is no substitute for comprehensive trade agreements. The Center for Strategic and International Studies will soon release its upcoming analysis on IPEF, based on conversations with over a dozen governments in the Indo-Pacific. 2 points from its analysis are instructive. First, U.S. engagement is welcome in the Indo-Pacific. One diplomat stressed in particular that his country wants the United States to lay out an affirmative economic strategy that complements its security presence in the region. Second, our partners see the IPEF as a proposal with many U.S. asks, few U.S. offers, and a variety of credible regional alternatives to the framework that could provide more tangible benefits. If the U.S. is to meet and exceed China's challenge, then the U.S. must make stronger commitments than China. Regrettably, if the administration's negotiating ambitions are low, its consultations with Congress on the few negotiations actually taking place is even lower. At last year's trade agenda hearing, Ambassador Tai, you stated that you would brief this committee before and after each negotiating session with respect to a waiver of the WTO TRIPS agreement. That hasn't happened. USTR recently issued a press release confirming that it had reached a compromise outcome on the TRIPS waiver in discussions with South Africa, India, and the European Union. USTR refuses to share the text of that outcome with this committee. While members may have different views on the merits of this waiver, every member here should agree with me that the administration cannot withhold documents concerning U.S. rights under a congressionally approved trade agreement. We need to see the document, and we need to ask questions because that is what respect for the Constitution requires. There are serious questions to be asked. For example, last week, South Africa and India joined with Russia and China to establish the BRICS Vaccine R&D Center on vaccine cooperation. Congress should know whether the text permits South Africa and India to share insights on U.S. intellectual property with Russia and China. USTR's transparency with the public is also poor. The American innovators who developed the vaccines provided plenty of evidence on why a waiver is unnecessary, including that 20 billion doses will be produced this year, more than enough to achieve the World Health Organization's vaccination target. The administration, however, has not shared with the public any evidence as to why a waiver will get shots into the arms any faster. I'm disappointed about negotiations and congressional consultation, but I also have concerns about enforcement. Americans need to compete on a level playing field, and I appreciate the administration's prosecution of 2 USMCA labor disputes under the Brown-Wyden mechanism, yet much more can be done. With respect to the USMCA, agricultural market challenges remain. Mexico continues to restrict potatoes and delay approval of biotech crops. Discriminatory practices targeting our technology companies are also increasing. Rather than launch cases, the administration appears to be in retreat. For example, the trade agenda highlights that USTR reached agreements to terminate our Section 301 investigations against various countries over discriminatory digital service taxes. Let's be very clear about what this means. Those countries are going to continue imposing discriminatory taxes on U.S. firms. They may give a credit one day, but only if Congress approves the Biden administration's international tax deal. The Biden administration is blessing foreign governments which discriminate against Americans as long as Congress refuses to go along with its plan to cede taxing rights and revenue to foreign competitors. Let me close with where I started. Past being prologue. History proves that Americans do not fear competition, but rise to it. And now is the time to seize on that history and go further on trade, not shrink from it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. I know we'll be working closely together on many of these issues. Ambassador, welcome. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the President's trade agenda. President Biden believes that trade can be a force for good that grows the middle class and addresses inequality. And he believes we are at our strongest when we work with others around the world. Over the last year, in coordination with my colleagues across the Biden administration, we have worked to repair strained relationships and recommitted the United States to the world's institutions. These partnerships have led to the united response to Russia's unjustified attack on Ukraine. Turning specifically to our work at USTR, our agenda begins with putting workers at the center of our trade policy. When we defend the rights of workers at home and abroad, labor standards go up, and we drive that race to the top. Farmers, ranchers, fishers, and food manufacturers are key to our trade agenda, and we have delivered real, economically meaningful wins for them. The 232 tariff arrangements and large civil aircraft frameworks with the EU and UK lifted retaliatory tariffs on billions of dollars of U.S. agricultural exports. The agreement with Japan will allow our exporters to meet Japan's growing beef demand. We regained access to the EU for our shellfish industry, and we've opened access for U.S. pork exports to India. We are also realigning the U.S.-China trade relationship. We launched a conversation with the PRC about its Phase 1 purchase commitment shortfalls and broader non-market practices. Those discussions have been unduly difficult, and it is time for us to turn the page on the old playbook. That starts with developing new domestic tools and making strategic investments to maintain our global competitive edge. We have made progress on this effort through the American Rescue Plan, the administration's focus on supply chain resilience, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Passing the Bipartisan Innovation Act will build on this significant progress. We have renewed our engagement with partners and allies and are developing innovative arrangements that strengthen our resilience and address the China challenge. For example, the global arrangement we are negotiating with the EU will be the world's first sectoral arrangement on steel and aluminum trade to tackle both emissions and non-market excess capacity. Beyond this cooperation, we have deepened our engagement with key trading partners through other avenues. We launched the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council to promote shared economic growth. We relaunched the United States-India Trade Policy Forum to enhance our bilateral relationship. And we hosted the first dialogue on the future of Atlantic trade in Baltimore last week with the United Kingdom. We will meet again in Scotland next month to consider what concrete, economically meaningful steps we can take to deepen our trade relationship. We are also committed to intensifying economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. USTR will lead efforts to craft a trade arrangement with our Indo-Pacific partners that includes high standard labor commitments, environmental sustainability, the digital economy, sustainable food systems, and science-based agricultural regulation, good regulatory practices, and trade facilitation. On the multilateral front, the Biden administration has continued efforts to make the WTO a force for good. We are working towards an intellectual property outcome to help end the pandemic. We will continue to engage with WTO members to get safe and effective vaccines to as many people as possible, and we are committed to bringing reform to the organization. The Biden administration also knows that enforcement is key to trade policy delivering on its promises. We have used the USMCA rapid response mechanism twice to defend workers' rights in Mexico, which helps workers here by driving a race to the top. We pursued dispute settlement with Canada to ensure that U.S. dairy farmers are treated fairly. We also initiated environmental consultations with Mexico to prevent unreported and unregulated fishing. A final important part of our trade agenda is promoting trade policy that is equitable, inclusive, and durable, and the President's trade agenda includes objectives to advance racial and gender equity. We will continue to pair these values with sustained stakeholder engagement. I want to close with one final point. Congress is our constitutional partner on trade, and collaboration is critical to our agenda and America's success. In an increasingly complicated world, I am more confident than ever that we can walk, chew gum, and play chess at the same time. I look forward to continuing this work in the year ahead with you. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Appreciate your being here. Let me start by focusing on what you said in your trade agenda with respect to environmental issues being front and center. You highlighted your goals of promoting sustainability, addressing carbon emissions, and enforcing the environmental commitments in trade agreements. So I want to focus on a concern that hits on all of these issues. Mexico is a key partner in the USMCA, And it sure looks to me like they are slamming the brakes on renewable energy reform. In recent years, Mexico made substantial efforts to modernize and green the electricity market. They gave the green light to foreign investment, and they opened their market, particularly to innovative American providers of renewable electricity. But as I just indicated, now it looks like they're in retreat. They're considering laws that concentrate market power and regulatory authority in the hands of the state-owned electric company. That result will mean a bigger focus on fossil fuels with limited opportunities for clean energy providers. So, Mexico's new reforms are a 1-2 punch against environmental progress in America. Not only are they a setback in the fight against the climate crisis, but they are denying American companies in the Pacific Northwest, for example, a fair shake in the Mexican market. And my view is what Mexico is doing now looks to me like it's running opposite from the promises Mexico made in the USMCA. So, Ambassador, as we've talked about, the United States needs to make sure that every chapter of USMCA is fully implemented and pays off for American workers and businesses and a cleaner climate in the Americas. That's what was pursued in USMCA. What are you doing to address Mexico's actions in the energy market that I've described?
Chairman Wyden, thank you for asking this very, very important question. Let me begin by affirming my agreement with you and my commitment that the USMCA must be enforced and implemented across all of its chapters, and we will be. That is an organizing principle of our work. I am also deeply concerned with the legislative and regulatory developments in the Mexican energy industry that we have seen in recent months. My team and I at USTR, along with much of the U.S. government, have expressed these concerns regularly and directly to our counterparts in the Mexican government. Just last week, I convened a roundtable with members of Congress, with members from our environmental organization community, from our energy industry that includes renewable energy companies as well as our more traditional energy companies. And the testimony I heard from them was powerful. They have been unified in expressing concerns with what is happening in Mexico, specifically with respect to the competitiveness of the North American energy market, as well as the competitiveness of Mexico's own energy industry. I have informed Mexico, and I assure you that we at USTR are looking at all available options under the USMCA to address these issues so that the USMCA can work for our stakeholders and protect our environment across all three countries.
Well, we'll want to work very closely with you because it seems to me that, Mexico on one area after another as it relates to greener energy and the challenge of environmental reform is walking back what they pledged in USMCA, and we can't sit by and abide that. Let me ask you one other question, if I might. It deals with Russia and China and the challenge of today. We all remember the searing image of the opening ceremony at the Olympics, President Xi and President Putin standing there together, asserting their friendship has, quote, no limits. And obviously, Xi was flexing his power to expand his authoritarian orbit and basically kind of thumbing his nose at the American-led international order. And that was before Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So how are you working with our allies to ensure that when the United States confronts China's anti-competitive behavior and theft of homegrown innovation, it's got the allies on board?
Well, Chairman Wyden, let me begin by saying that working with our allies is a key component of the Biden administration's approach to a smarter and more effective strategy towards China, and this has been the case since day one of this administration. I have invested a lot of time personally, as have my colleagues in the cabinet, to rebuild relationships and trust that were, at the beginning of our administration, badly damaged. This has involved finding creative, sometimes unconventional, but ultimately effective solutions to longstanding problems and irritations that we have had with our strongest partners and allies, like, for example, the WTO aircraft disputes or the steel and aluminum tariffs. We've also worked to establish new cooperative mechanisms like the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, as well as frameworks and dialogues, so that we can focus with our allies on effectively addressing the massive distortions being caused by other economies like China, but frankly, in more recent weeks, like the challenges that we are facing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As I have mentioned, it is high time for us to turn the page on the old playbook with respect to China. That old playbook had us focused exclusively on changing China's behavior. We must now expand our work to include a strategy to vigorously defend our values and economic interests.
Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up first, Ambassador Tai, with regard to the issue which Senator Wyden raised, namely the enforcement of in Mexico of our USMCA agreement. You've indicated, and Senator Wyden pointed out, that on the environmental and labor front, you are actively pursuing efforts to try to enforce the agreement. But I see no activity to try to enforce the market access parts of the agreement. And let me focus my question specifically on potatoes. I think it's a little over a year ago now, both you and I were in Mexico, and both you and I raised the potato issue. And both you and I got, a response from the Mexican government that they were going to resolve it. The Mexican Supreme Court even is ruling in our favor on this issue. Yet I don't see any enforcement action against Mexico on USMCA with regard to potato access. Could you respond to that?
Well, Mr. Crapo, know how important the potatoes are to you, and you know how much I love potatoes. With respect to USMCA enforcement, again, let me reiterate my commitment to enforcing all aspects. And on market access, I want to also raise the dairy case that we have prosecuted.
Exactly.
On potatoes in particular, I just spoke to USDA Secretary Vilsack last night about this issue. We have not given up hope, even though we have been taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward for many months now. I just want to let you know how high on our radar this is and how focused we are on trying to secure a win here, and to let you know that all options are on the table if we are not able to secure that win.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. With regard to the IPEF, the administration is very clear that IPEF will not include market access initiatives. Given that the administration wants to raise our trading partners' labor and environmental standards through IPEF, with which I don't disagree, why take the carrot of market access off the table?
So I appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the approach that we are contemplating and consulting with all of you on with respect to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It is true that market access, strictly speaking as a trade terminology, is not on the table at this time in the framework. But I want to distinguish between what we mean by market access in trade vocabulary versus market access in ordinary English. Market access, as we talk about it in trade discussions and negotiations, typically means tariff liberalization. And that is true. We are not starting these conversations with tariff liberalization, in large part because our traditional trade models and traditional FTAs have led us to a place where we are facing a considerable backlash that we are listening to from our own people about concerns regarding the offshoring and outsourcing of American jobs and opportunities through these types of arrangements. That does not mean, however, that we are not bringing an economic engagement to this region that does not have economically meaningful outcomes. So in the sense of market access in ordinary English, which is to enhance our access to each other's markets, that is very much a part of what we are doing. In terms of the high labor and environment standards, I really want to thank you for affirming your commitment to the standards in U.S. trade policy practice, because that is exactly the kind of practice that we want to bring to our trading partners in order to counteract those forces that have tended to bleed out our industries to other regions. We would like to use trade to raise standards around the world, to raise standards to the standards that we have here so that we can all enjoy the kinds of lives and opportunities that we would like.
Well, I understand, and as I said, I agree with that. But I define market access as free trade agreements, and I just don't see why we cannot engage in develop. And we've got nations in the Indo-Pacific who are crying out for free trade negotiations with us, so that they can strengthen their relationship to us economically, rather than being tied to China. And so I just want to state that I believe that we need to engage on free trade negotiations in terms of market access, and not define market access as some kind of a framework or something else. One last quick question. This is regarding our China policy. In your opening statement, you report that China failed to live up to its Phase 1 agreement. It's easier for the public to see China's unfulfilled purchase commitments, but it is much harder for anyone to know where China fell short on these structural commitments. Why doesn't the USTR provide this committee with its assessment on which obligations China failed to comply? And how do you plan to redress China's failure to meet these commitments?
Well, Ranking Member Crapo, you're right. In terms of the purchase commitments, those are the most transparent because everybody has access to the trade data. I would be happy to engage with you beyond the public statements that I have already made with respect to our assessment of China's performance under the Phase 1 agreement. One point I would like to make, however, is that with respect to the commitments that China signed up for, there are a number of different kinds. Obviously, there are the purchase commitments. There are commitments on laws and regulations that China had to pass. And then over time, especially with respect to the intellectual property and forced tech transfer commitments, China's compliance is going to need to be measured by the experience of our own industries who are seeking to do business in China. So it is a dynamic picture, but I am all for having that conversation with you and others, and believe that we have been having that conversation as well.
Thank you.
I thank my colleague. Senator Stabenow and Senator Grassley are involved in a discussion, and the order would, under normal circumstances, go to Senator Cantwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. And Ambassador Tai, thank you for being here. I know you're a representative of the Biden administration, and you're reflecting the views of the Biden administration. I would just like to say I agree with my colleagues from the Northwest, but particularly my colleague from Idaho. I don't find where we are, and we had a conversation with you, a roundtable discussion with our members, and you said, well, we're trying to reset the table here with China. So we gave you more time. And now we're here and we're hearing this focus that we're not saying that opening market access and getting rid of tariffs is a priority. And that's what the people in my state want to hear. As a very trade-dependent state, they want to know that we are fighting to increase market access. When you think about wheat, when you think about potatoes, when you think about some of these other products, it's more than 70% of the product is an export market. And when you look at the impacts of the 301 tariffs and how bad apples have been hurt, we want resolution to these issues. I mean, we are not even getting the exclusion at this point. So it's very hard to look at this equation, and this isn't specific to the Biden administration. I didn't agree with the last administration's approach on this. I don't agree that just throwing down tariffs as we did on the solar industry, and now we're 10 plus years later, and we have no resolution of this issue. I don't think that's the path forward. So I have wholeheartedly supported enforcement. I got USTR a bunch of money out of the customs agency so you could hire more lawyers and we could beef up USTR so that it could go around the globe and do enforcement. And guess what? It's working. I led the charge on getting more money for capacity building in Mexico, something nobody really wants to say. They don't want to say that our government is paying to help build capacity in Mexico so we can enforce trade agreements. I'll say that because I believe in trade. So I'm just trying to understand this notion that somehow trade agreements are 20th century tools, and that they're some sort of recluse of something we're not going to do anymore, and that the Indo-Pacific Agreement will not have a mechanism that's specifically focused on opening up markets. So My people believe, the people in the state of Washington doing business, growing crops, want to know always, what are we doing to increase market access? That's what they want to know. So I want to understand exactly how this, I hear what you're saying to my colleague here. You're saying, well, it's kind of on the table, but it's not really on the table. And right now, with these tariffs and the impacts in India and other places, there was no place to go. There was no place to go. This whole effort, I blame a lot on the Trump administration and their policies. It's easy to throw down. It's easy to throw down around here. And then guess what? Do you get any bills done? No. So it does take the negotiation. So I really want to understand, I'm for the labor rights, I'm for enforcement, I'm for capacity building. But why can't we be for opening market access right now and getting rid of tariffs, or at least getting the exclusions done on time?
Well, Senator Cantwell, your views on trade are well known to me, and I know that for the state of Washington, you were an export powerhouse, and I understand your views. Let me just clarify some of my remarks. We have been opening markets. When we began our administration, in what I would describe as a tariff-rich environment. In the last year, we have either lifted or averted over $20 billion of tariffs just between the U.S. and Europe, $7 billion of which was applied or going to be applied to agricultural products. So we are opening markets. We are also opening markets in other ways in our work with our trading partners through trade and investment framework agreements, through the TPF with India. Is there more work to do? Absolutely, there is. On my comments about free trade agreements being 20th century tools, that really is just a statement of fact. That free trade agreements are something that we did a lot of in the late 1900s, 1980 to 2010 or 12 or so. There is a place for free trade agreements in our toolbox, but even there, I feel like our approach to free trade agreements needs to be updated. We need to update our toolbox to reflect the realities of today, and that has to do with bringing along all of our economy for the United States in these trade policies so that we can continue to trade. I take very seriously the lessons that we have learned in the past 5-7 years around trade agreements that we have pursued that have been so big and have been so uneven in terms of the wins and losses they're going to deliver for our economy that they have collapsed under their own weight. Our approach is guided by the principle that we need to be able to trade in a way where we bring along our stakeholders instead of pitting them against each other. And so your stakeholders are absolutely important to me, as are the stakeholders of your colleagues on this committee.
I see my time has expired. I would just say that I don't see these issues as an exclusion to one or the other, and people here have been working to update the tools that we have. I see the difference here is we have a president who has a great global presence. He should be advocating a global economic opportunity for the United States. We're working hard to get a bill to increase our export capacity as it relates to the supply chain that we're going to build here in the United States and build great products. So we're going to do everything that we can. But trade changes culture. Trade helps us build partnerships around the globe. But it's not just us. The biggest economic opportunity for the United States is to sell things outside of the United States. That means you have to have market access and you have to have trade. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague who knows so much about this subject. And let me see if I can kind of bring the 2 points together, and then we'll go quickly on to Senator Grassley. I am all in the fight for market access. And Senator Cantwell makes important points about why that is so urgent to folks in the Pacific Northwest. Part of our challenge is to build a modern market access toolbox, and it needs to have all of these tools that we're all talking about, and then we work on a bipartisan basis to apply the appropriate tool, the appropriate situation. So we'll have a lot of conversations about this in the days ahead, but certainly my Northwest colleagues know an awful lot about trade, and we're going to be working together. Okay, next is Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming, and particularly It hasn't always been easy to get people in your position to come and do what the law requires by being here for these sort of oversight things. When you met with us last year, you were just getting started. I'm happy to have you as our trade representative. However, I'm extremely concerned that more than a year into this administration, that it seems to me, you will probably protest this, but that the White House is not allowing you to use your talents to be an advocate for free and fair trade. You've probably heard me say that agriculture markets access is the locomotive that drives any trade negotiations. I believe this administration is falling behind China and other competitors by not negotiating market access to Indo-Pacific. On top of this, we also see the administration falling behind on confirming very important key trading posts, particularly Chief Agriculture Negotiator, and even outside of your department, we don't have a Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Affairs and Agriculture. So my first question is, and I've got at least 3 questions I want to ask you. This may, could probably eat up all the time on this question, but try to save some time. Could you tell us if you have a strategy to increase market access for U.S. agricultural products?
Yes, Senator Grassley. And let me just begin with a statement of values that I think our American farmers are some of the most admirable Americans and hardest workers that I've ever met. Market access for our farmers is absolutely important to me and important to our ability to conduct trade policy. I work with Secretary Vilsack extremely closely. I consider him to be an exemplar of leadership at the USDA and also a very good personal friend. And so I want you to know that I care deeply about our farmers and about allowing them to have opportunities to compete and also to diversify their opportunities.
Thank you. We have all seen the suffering from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A product of this invasion is disrupting in our grain markets. Apart from the Ukrainians, President Biden has said that this invasion will lead to rising food crises and human suffering in the poorest countries. The president also said that the administration has been talking to the EU about ending trade restrictions. The EU has said that they're considering it. What engagement has your agency had with the EU on issuing an import waiver for biotech crops, and will your agency engage with the EU moving forward to enable science-based regulations for biotechnology so farmers in our country and around the world can use biotech to increase production?
We are continually engaging with our EU counterparts on ag trade issues between the U.S. and the EU, including biotech trade. This has been a traditionally difficult area between the United States and the European Union. I saw that through the course of last year as well, working with Secretary Vilsack. I do believe that the current disruptions to trade created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine may provide us new opportunities and windows for collaboration with the EU, which we are also seeking to capitalize on.
While it appears that the EU might be moving in the right direction along this line, it also appears that Mexico is going the other way. It seems like Mexico is blatantly violating the commitments made under USMCA regarding the treatment of biotech products. What is your strategy to encourage Mexico to implement a transparent and science-based risk assessment process for agricultural biotechnology? And do you plan to use the USMCA to engage with the Mexican government and resolve its treatment of agricultural biotechnology?
This is another area where I have been closely coordinated and cooperating with Secretary Vilsack. And just to get to the bottom line on your question, yes, we are looking at all of our tools under the USMCA and thinking through our strategy.
Yeah. In regard to what you said to Crapo about potatoes, I know that the Secretary of Agriculture is very committed to doing what you want done, Senator Crapo. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Next will be Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Welcome back. We're so glad to have you and so appreciate, Ambassador Tai, all of your hard work. Thank you for being with us today. I know you were at Ways and Means yesterday, so it's a busy week on the Hill. And I first want to mention, I know that my friend Senator Grassley has said it and maybe others, but it is critical we get a chief agricultural negotiator at USTR. It's just absolutely important. As you know, markets are critical for agriculture, and so we really need to get this across the finish line as soon as possible. Please let me know how I can help to be able to make that happen. I also know you've been very focused on a number of fronts, including USMCA enforcement, as well as your ongoing negotiations with China, as well as new challenges we face holding Russia accountable for their brutal invasion of Ukraine. So a lot of important work to do. Let me first start with USMCA, though, and thank you for your leadership and your team's leadership to hold Canada accountable for failing to meet their dairy market access commitment under USMCA. This is something I worked hard on as part of USMCA, and congratulations on the first successful dispute settlement panel verdict you secured earlier this year. It's critical for our dairy farmers in Michigan and around the country that we also make sure that Canada comes into compliance. It's just absolutely critical. And I hear concerns all the time that Canada is going to continue to play games, and their recent proposal allowing them to limit dairy market access. And so we really need your continued focus in this area. So could you speak just a little about your plan for ensuring that Canada lives up to their original commitments under USMCA so that our dairy farmers see the full benefits that were promised?
Senator Stabenow, yes. My view on Canada's commitments under the USMCA with respect to dairy is that Canada promised increased access to its market for American dairy farmers. And until we are able to accomplish that, we will continue to pursue the tools and avenues available to us under USMCA, hard tools and soft tools. I have a very collaborative and good relationship with my Canadian counterpart, and I have raised these issues in my conversations with her, but we will not give up until we see those promises realized.
Thank you so much. And of course, coming from Michigan, we have wonderful relationships and friendships with our Canadian friends. This is an area that is really so important for us and pushing back on. I think you've also been asked about biotech issues. And so let me just say and agree with colleagues that biotechnology has enormous potential to help us increase productivity while farmers address the climate crisis. And as you know, we need regulatory systems that are effective, that are science-based, and transparent. So I'm very concerned that Mexico seems to be making decisions that are not founded in science and causing long delays in biotech approvals that could have real-world consequences on farmers and future innovation in the industry. And importantly, these decisions are in violation of the commitments that Mexico made under the USMCA. So what is your strategy to engage with Mexico and encourage them to implement transparent, science-based approval processes for agriculture biotechnology that they already agreed to?
So Secretary Vilsack and I have been working hand in glove on the Mexico agriculture challenges, and we have been pursuing a strategy of cooperation and consultation with our counterparts in Mexico. I do think that at this point we are reassessing where we are and the kinds of tools that we need to bring to bear. And so at USTR, we are looking at the full range of tools, and in close coordination with our partners at USDA and with you and others here, we'll look at next steps.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then finally, let me just say the race to be a leader in research and development and manufacturing, of course, of next generation technology is an important part of our future and economy, and it's not just limited to agriculture. So we need to make things and grow things, and in my opinion, we've not lost this future to China or any place else. And so we're working to pass important investments in clean energy and advanced manufacturing through competition and innovation, important legislation in front of us right now. Senator Manchin and Senator Daines and I have legislation to invest in clean energy domestic manufacturing, which is so important. Could you speak at all about what we need to do here in this competition and what role that our trade policies can play?
Senator Stabenow, I'm delighted to hear about all of the efforts that are being undertaken up here in the Congress. We have been tracking them closely. They are sometimes inside of the trade lane and oftentimes adjacent to trade in order to continue to be the competitive powerhouse that the United States has been and wants to continue to be. We're going to need to coordinate our trade policies with these types of investments, and we're going to need to do it on a sustained basis. So I want to commend you and your colleagues for doing this work, and I look forward to continuing our work and connecting your efforts with our trade policies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Next will be Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, welcome back to the committee. Just when does the administration plan to nominate a chief agricultural negotiator?
Senator Thune, we have nominated one, and I'm very grateful for Elaine Trevino's willingness to serve, and I look forward to working with her in another capacity that she will take on in the Biden administration. At the moment, I'm working very hard with our administration to name a new chief agriculture negotiator nominee. As soon as possible. I want to assure you here that your interests and mine are absolutely aligned.
Okay. Well, we're a year into the administration, and it's an expression, I think, of priorities. And I can tell you that there are a lot of farmers and ranchers and agricultural producers, growers around this country who are very, very concerned that the promotion of agricultural exports be a priority. And it doesn't seem like it is. All right, is the administration planning to submit Trade Promotion Authority, a proposal request?
Well, Senator Thune, with all due respect, in terms of Trade Promotion Authority, that is legislation, and I'm happy to speak with you and to work with you on it if it is something that you're interested in.
Well, I'm interested in it, but typically what happens is that's an administration that requests it. And in the Obama administration, there were many of us here, Republicans, who were willing to work with the president from another party on something that is a big priority, I think, for America's economic vitality, obviously economic security, and I would argue in the parts of the world we're talking about here, national security. Is the administration right now pursuing any trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, specifically the CPTPP, which would more strongly promote American interests and leadership?
We are pursuing economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific right now. That does not mean the CPTPP. And let me just draw together a point on CPTPP and the TPA, which is I also lived through the fights up here in the Congress over TPA and TPP back in 2014, 2015, and 2016. I feel very strongly that American trade policy is at its best, strongest, and most durable when we are acting in the most bipartisan way. And so my commitment to you is, with respect to trade policy, promoting trade and also working with the Congress, that I am looking for strong bipartisanship and a unified American voice, and I'm happy to engage with you on those issues from that viewpoint.
Well, and I'm not, and that's great, and you know your subject well, and because you know your subject well, I just think that the 2022 trade policy agenda that supports a worker-centered trade policy may be a convenient political slogan, but it's not a serious trade strategy. And, we're the leading economy in the world for a reason. And a major part of that is because American exporters, and by that I mean farmers, businessmen and women, and innovators and entrepreneurs boldly go into global markets and oftentimes succeed. And just as an example, U.S. farm and food product exports grew from $46 billion in 1994 to more than $177 billion last year. U.S. exports support a lot of good-paying jobs at home and help spread the reach of American influence abroad. And so I'm just trying to get you all to focus. I understand this framework, but because there isn't market access in there, because there aren't tangible benefits delivered, it's a lot of really flowery rhetoric. But I'm trying to see where this does anything to open markets for our farmers and ranchers in areas of the world where America just flat needs to be a presence, needs to be competitive, and needs to be leading the way. If we are going to isolate China, doing business with a lot of countries in that region just seems like makes a lot of sense. So let me just ask a fairly direct question: do you agree that farmers, producers, and others that rely on exports and lower cost imports are part of the backbone of our economy?
I do agree that they are.
And will the administration work to build upon the success of U.S. exports in the context of any new trade agreements or initiatives?
We are doing so across everything in trade policy that we are pursuing right now.
And I think a lot of us would differ with that, and I would hope that your clear-eyed focus would be market access, creating opportunities that are real, that are meaningful, that are tangible, and working with us in a bipartisan way to do that. You expressed a willingness to do that. I would certainly hope that you would, and starting with nominating an ag negotiator. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune. And you and I have worked together often on trade issues and look forward to doing that again. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I regularly hear from ambassadors of some of the countries that may participate in IPEF that it is not sufficiently ambitious. What has been the administration's response to that criticism, and how, if at all, has the scope of the negotiations changed based on requests from other potential partners?
Well, Senator Menendez, I disagree with the sense that it is not sufficiently ambitious, and in a lot of our interactions and conversations with our trading partners in the Indo-Pacific, we have been making the case that what we are trying to do in the economic framework for the Indo-Pacific is new. It will include innovative elements, some innovative for the region, some innovative for the trade policy conversation overall because of the evolving challenges that we are facing. That's where I would begin, which is new things require some time for socialization and for people to appreciate where the economic meaning is going to come. But we are committed to this region, to our partners, and to engaging and enhancing our economic relations.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me just say, as my own observation, not theirs, I don't think it's as robust as I think we need. I think we missed an opportunity in TPP, and that's happened, and we're not going to revisit it. But at the same time, when we are thinking about our challenge with China, which the administration has adopted as their number one geostrategic challenge, the geoeconomic strategy to compete with China, you certainly, I hope, will pursue an ambitious agreement that sets high standards across the breadth of our economic relationships within the region. And it's critical that the IPEF make real progress in setting strong standards across the Indo-Pacific to further solidify a democratic rules-based trading regime. Let me ask you, Taiwan is a key trading partner of the United States, one of whom we have a strategic relationship that is intimately intertwined with our economic security, particularly as it relates to trade in semiconductors. It's a key stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific economic community. It's a vibrant democracy that respects the rule of law. It's exactly the type of partner whom we should work to strike high standard trade agreements. Several weeks ago, the Taiwan government officially requested to be part of the IPEF negotiations. What has been the administration's response to that request?
Well, Senator Menendez, I completely agree with you that Taiwan is an essential trading partner for us and also an essential partner overall. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I want to emphasize this for everyone on this committee and publicly as well, is a framework that we are developing, and it is something that must reflect also the views of all of you and our stakeholders. So on the point of Taiwan, we are in general in conversations with those who are interested in joining this framework. I do also want to emphasize and recall that in the last year we have revived the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement engagements with Taiwan, including at my level, which had been idle for 5 years, and we will continue to look at all.
So let me get back to my original question. What has been the administration's response to that request? Are you going to invite Taiwan to be part of the IPEF negotiations or not?
Participation in the IPEF is still under consideration, and as far as I'm aware, no decisions have been made.
Okay, well, I hope, and I get a sense from that answer, that we will not include Taiwan within the IPEF, which is missing an opportunity, both for the vision we have for Taiwan and also for the sort of regional and trade economic architecture. If it's not invited to join the negotiations, I hope the administration considers an agreement with Taiwan that extends the benefits on a bilateral basis, which would certainly be the next runner-up. Finally, at last year's trade agenda hearing, I asked you to commit to brief the committee before and after each negotiating session with regards to the TRIPS waiver, and you agreed to do that. Do you believe you kept that commitment?
I do.
Well, about 3 weeks ago, press reported on a proposed text that appeared to be a detailed compromise on the issue, and USTR, in fact, released a statement confirming that a compromise had been reached. Yet no one on this committee appears to have known anything about the details of that agreement before it was announced. We were kept in the dark. And so, to me, this is an example, there's a difference between notification and consultation. Notification is when we got that. Consultation is when there's an engagement about what it is that you may be considering agreeing to so that you can have input from Congress. And that's why, I have real concerns. In your testimony, you said Congress is your constitutional partner on trade, but from my perspective, you haven't acted that way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Wyden, if I may respond to that, because sure. I think it is important for the overall conversation and for a sense of my integrity as the U.S. Trade Representative. Senator Menendez, in my testimony yesterday at the House Ways and Means Committee, I made the point, and I want to make it here for all of you as well, that there have been no agreements made at the WTO. And so with respect to whatever may be on the table, I consider these hearings to be a part of a consultation process, and I continue to want to hear from all of you. In fact, you and others on this committee have made yourselves very clear to me in terms of your positions, and I want you to know that I have heard your concerns, and I have also heard the concerns of the other members of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but just to say, the USTR put out a statement that there had been a compromise agreement before anybody was invoked. So having come to talk to us after you had the compromise agreement is not input, because I don't think you're going to change the compromise agreement based upon anything you hear. So I don't think it is a fulfillment, and I hope we can get to a better place. Thank you.
My colleague is raising this issue of consultation, and I think the point, Ambassador, is it can bring us all together, is we need consultation apart from hearings. In other words, it just needs to be ongoing. So thank you. All right, we're now Portman, Carper, Toomey, Cardin will be the next four in order of appearance. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, good to have you back before us. As you know, I feel strongly that you need to have the ability to negotiate trade opening agreements. That would make your job a lot more interesting, as well as the jobs of your associates. So that's a broader topic, but I think in the context of the Competes Act, also known as USICA, also known by about 5 other names, I think there's an opportunity for us to do something. And you and I have talked about it. I've talked to Secretary of Commerce about it. So I hope you will be working with us on that. If there's going to be trade adjustment assistance, typically that's with Trade Promotion Authority. And my view is that these agreements that are right before us, including the UK agreement, which has virtually no issues as it relates to labor or the environment, are low-hanging fruit, and it would be great to get America back in the game. With regard to China, and your discussion in your testimony about the need to use existing tools, you refer to the Phase 1 agreement as part of the old playbook because China has not lived up to its commitments. And I get that. It's frustrating when China doesn't live up to its commitments. But I don't think we can just move along and say, so let's start to work on other ways in which we can open more opportunities. Instead, I think we have to stick with that agreement and use what's in the agreement, which is dispute resolution. I think if we just say we're going to forget that and make that part of the old playbook, I think it sends a terrible message because I think when China makes an agreement with us and they don't fulfill their obligations, we have to exercise our legal rights under that. And I think it's going to be much more difficult to make progress with China on the subsidies, on state-owned enterprises, on suppression of labor rights, and other things if we don't insist that the agreement be adhered to. So I guess my question to you would be, are you willing to move forward with dispute resolution? Are you willing to commit to utilizing the dispute resolution process that the United States enjoys as part of that Phase 1 agreement, possibly culminating in restrictions on trade with China as necessary to enforce the agreement?
Senator Portman, it's always a pleasure to see you. On your question on China, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify my position and what I've said because I have seen it reported perhaps a bit inaccurately, which is to say it is the time to turn the page on the old playbook, which focused exclusively on pressuring China and seeking China to change its ways or, pressing China for compliance. We are not giving up on pressing China on compliance or on changing its ways. And yes, all tools remain on the table with respect to dispute settlement and enforcement. But my main point is that that's not the only thing we can do now. And we have to expand our strategy to include developing the tools that we need to defend the interests of our economy. So in fact, what I'm saying is we're committing to doing more work and our strategy needs to expand.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think using those existing tools we have are important. Again, setting a precedent of not using the dispute resolution tools that we have, I think would be problematic for China and others. Let me talk to you about new tools, because that's the other point that you make. I've talked about this a lot. We just don't have the tools to keep up with China, in my view, as they try to undermine our national competitiveness. They're subsidizing manufacturing in many countries through their Belt and Road Initiative, and yet our trade enforcers are powerless to combat those subsidies. Our bipartisan legislation with Senator Brown called Level the Playing Field 2.0 contains new tools to deal with that reality. I mean, it's what's happening out there, the transshipments and particularly the Belt and Road subsidies. That bill is something I'm pushing very hard, as you know, to have included, as it is in the House version in the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act we talked about earlier. Thank you for your support of this approach. Can you explain to the committee how this legislation would help to combat China's unfair trade practices?
Well, Senator Portman, let me begin by commending you and Senator Brown for working in a bipartisan way and bicamerally on this legislation and this initiative. In terms of how it would help us, I just want to emphasize that most of our trade enforcement tools date back to the 1970s and the 1980s, and it is critical that we retain those tools. But over time, as the global economy has evolved around us, our tools have not kept up. And so the updates and the enhancements that are in the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 are exactly in the spirit of what we need right now, which is the tailoring of a tool set and expansion of a tool set that is going to be up to the task of meeting the challenges that we're facing today.
And with China in particular, would you agree?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. I always like the exchanges of you kind of NBA all-stars of U.S. trade kind of history. Senator Toomey's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Tai, welcome. I supported your nomination because I knew you had the knowledge and the competence and the ability to do the job, but also because you stated in your nomination hearing, and I quote, you stated your intention in the nomination hearing to pursue trade policies that support American innovation and enhance our competitive edge, unquote. A year later, I'm still kind of waiting to see that. And one of the reasons I say that is because I just don't see a focus on expanding market access. One of the major areas of responsibility for the USTR, according to your own website, is, and I quote, expansion of market access for American goods and services. And of course, that's a two-way street. The phrase expanding market access, not in your testimony today. It's not a part of the IPEF. And aside from dialing back some of the previous administration's most counterproductive trade wars, to my knowledge, you really haven't been pursuing tariff reductions. Every single presidential administration since Reagan has initiated negotiations on a new FTA. They've done this to increase market access and to help U.S. industries and workers grow and thrive. The UK, Kenya, Taiwan, Indo-Pacific countries are just a few of the countries that have reached out to us. They want to strengthen their trading relationship, and that includes having more market access. And yet, thus far, we're not taking them up on it. Now, I get that President Biden ultimately makes this decision. It's not yours. But you are the U.S. trade rep. You're the president's primary trade advisor. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's in America's best interest to pursue free trade agreements with other countries?
So, Senator Toomey, if you'll allow me to back up just a little bit.
Just a little bit, but we've got to do it quickly because I'm going to run out of time.
Okay. If by market access you mean economically meaningful outcomes, and if by market access you mean the removal of tariffs, we have accomplished quite a bit of that in the first year. And I mentioned this to Senator Cantwell, but we began in a very, very tariff-rich environment, and we have removed $20 billion worth of, or avoided $20 billion worth of tariffs in our first year. To your point about free trade agreements, let me say this. I encounter this quite a bit, including from my members of Congress on these two committees, which is that trade policy, market access, trade enforcement takes lots of different forms. And I know that trade agreements are maybe the most fun form, and our traditional trade agreements. Let me put it this way. We are interested in pursuing trade agreements with our partners, but we are also interested in ensuring, just like our toolbox on enforcement, we are committed to ensuring that our trade agreements practice evolves with the times.
Okay. Here's the thing. My understanding is the U.S. currently has 14 FTAs with 20 countries. You recently seem to be suggesting that you think FTAs are a 20th century tool. But the fact is, China has 8 currently being negotiated. The EU has 14 in the process of being negotiated. You may think this is a 20th century tool. It looks like the rest of the world thinks this is a 21st century tool. And what this means is that China and the European Union are expanding market access for their producers and competition for their consumers, and they're getting market share that we're going to miss out on. I think the data is very, very clear. There's all kinds of studies that show that trade agreements lead to more jobs, higher pay, increased economic growth, more options, and lower costs for consumers. It's all kinds of great net outcomes. Foreign trade supports over 40 million U.S. jobs. I mean, I think you know this data. But without putting market access on the table and lowering tariffs and eliminating barriers, we're just not going to make the progress we could be making, that other countries want to make, that we should want to make. And my understanding, in the 40 years since the U.S. began negotiating our first free trade agreement with Israel, every single U.S. trade rep has worked on or completed negotiations of an FTA. My concern is that you might be on track to be the first trade rep not to continue that streak, and that would come at a big cost to our country. I just hope that you will be an advocate for this really important tool to expand trade.
Time of the gentleman's expired. I think Senator Carper is online, and then Senator Cardin. Senator Carper, are you online?
I'm right here. Can you hear me, sir?
Great. So Senator Carper and then Senator Cardin.
Trade Rep Tai, welcome aboard. Great to see you, and thanks for your leadership and service in this capacity. I have 3 questions. One is a worker. I want to talk about worker-centric approach to digital trade policy. Second, reform of the 301 trade exclusion process, something that Senator Portman and I have been heavily focused on. And third would be intellectual property waiver of corporate tax. The first, though, is a worker-centric approach to the digital trade policy. And Ambassador, I want to thank you for testifying, not just before committee today, but thank you for your service and way back, going back in the Ways and Means Committee and even before that. I applaud the Biden administration's commitment to engage with our allies through the creation of an Indo-Pacific economic framework. And one area of bipartisan interest is the development of standards to promote openness and transparency in the digital economy, something we've talked about. Through digital trade rules, we have the opportunity to uplift workers, to help small businesses compete, and to spur American innovation and entrepreneurship. Here's my question. Ambassador Tai, what approach should the United States take when negotiating digital trade standards? How can this approach advance the Biden administration's vision for worker-centered trade policy? Please go ahead.
Senator Carper, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to see you. I appreciate this question in particular because I think it gets lost in the shuffle some. When we are talking about digital trade, that is actually a really inclusive topic because so much of our economy is becoming digitalized every single day. So in terms of an approach to digital trade, it is absolutely critical that we bring a comprehensive approach, a holistic one with respect to how we think about digital trade and the fact that digital trade at this point affects everyone. And therefore, our engagement with our stakeholders needs to be holistic, robust, and comprehensive. Our concerns that we hear from our stakeholders around the offshoring and outsourcing of our jobs extends increasingly beyond the manufacturing sector to the services sector. And we take very seriously at USTR the necessity to conduct our trade policy in a way that brings along all of the U.S. economy and our stakeholders. And so a worker-centric approach to digital trade is one that is comprehensive, that is meaningful, that recognizes the limits of where Congress has acted and spoken and where it has not, and also reflects the views, the aspirations, and also the anxieties of our stakeholders across our economy.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. If I could turn to Section 301 tariff exclusion process. So as you know, since 2018, the trade war initiated by President Trump has wreaked havoc on American businesses, on manufacturers, on farmers and consumers. Senator Portman and I have long advocated for relief from the Section 301 tariffs, especially for imported goods that are only available from China. And I appreciate the recent announcements by the USTR that a limited number of tariff exclusions would be reinstated. That's good news. However, I remain concerned about the impact of existing tariffs on businesses in my state and across our country. Question is this: moving forward, are you considering more comprehensive Section 301 tariff exclusions? How do these tariffs fit into the Biden administration's broader China strategy? Please go ahead. Thank you.
Senator Carper, we need, and I think that there is very broad bipartisan support for this particular view, we need a realignment in our trade relationship with China. We need for our relationship to be more strategic and in favor of our ability to compete. Tariffs do have a role. Nevertheless, in this realignment, we need to take a strategic look at our tariffs, and we also need to recognize that realignment is something that requires a transition that cannot be accomplished overnight. So I committed in my speech on the Biden administration's China trade policy last October that we would start the first exclusions process, which we did and just concluded last week, and that we would consider additional exclusions processes as warranted. That continues to be true today.
Mr. Chairman, my time's about to expire. I just want to mention a third question and ask the ambassador to respond on the record. But I understand that the administration has been working with some of our WTO partners to develop a possible agreement on waiving intellectual property protections for COVID vaccine. The status and details of the agreement remains unclear. And my question I'd ask you to answer for the record is, how does the administration intend to increase its engagement with Congress and outside stakeholders as this process continues? If you answer that on the record, I'd be most grateful. Great to see you. Thanks for your good work and for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I'm going to recognize myself, and after I complete my questioning, Senator Cassidy would be next. Ambassador Tai, first, thank you for coming to Baltimore. It was, I thought, an incredible occasion. You could see firsthand the investment made at the Port of Baltimore to be as competitive as we can globally. We have the supermax capacities in our cranes and in our berths. And you got to see some of the container ships actually come in. They timed it for your visit, which I thought was good. And UK is a critically important trading partner to the United States and certainly to the Port of Baltimore. So we are very pleased to see that we are engaged in conversations with our trading partners in UK to expand opportunity for both countries. That will mean more jobs for the people of Maryland. So I just really first wanted to thank you for that initiative and thank you for coming to Baltimore. I want to cover first the Indo-Pacific framework, and I watch every word you say, so I want to just critique, if I might, that in your list of objectives you included, rightly so, workers' issues, promoting workers and businesses, advancing strong labor standards, tackling climate change, all of which I completely agree. But I was disappointed knowing the countries that are in the framework, you did not include one of the areas that has been a very high priority of this committee, advancing good governance and anti-corruption. I know you're committed to that, but I would ask that there's sensitivity when that's not included in the list of our objectives.
Senator Cardin, your leadership on those issues is very, very clear. Good governance issues are included in the trade pillar under what we call good regulatory practices. And again, this gets lost in our jargon. And if I were to translate it into ordinary English, it's in our regulations and engaging with our partners, ensuring that there is a notice and comment process that allows for participation. So that part is in the trade pillar. On anti-corruption, that is in our organization in a separate pillar on anti-corruption and tax, and that is a pillar that Secretary Raimondo and her team will be leading. It doesn't mean that USTR won't be involved, but we'll lead the trade pillar, and that pillar she and her team will lead.
Thanks for the explanation. I would assume that the environmental issues will also be in the regulatory framework, so the more you can put a spotlight on it's our expectation. We made it, I know you're not using TPA, I know TPA has expired, but we made that a principal trading objective. So I just would appreciate keeping us engaged as to the progress made, particularly with several of the countries that are included in the framework. We recognize there's no enforcement. We recognize the challenges of enforcement. Let me talk about one country that's in this discussion, and that is Japan. Congratulations on being able to complete some really difficult issues with the beef industry and some others with Japan. It looks like it's been extremely positive, and quite frankly, Japan's a major trading partner in the Port of Baltimore as well as with our country. And it doesn't go unnoticed that Japan was extremely aggressive in supporting the sanctions against Russia and helping provide important equipment to the Ukrainians. So they've been a true partner. So it seems to me Japan's one of the easier partners that we have in the Indo-Pacific area. And I was just curious as to how you see the next chapter in our trade relations unfolding.
So, Senator Cardin, I would agree with you that Japan is an absolutely important partner with whom we have a really strong relationship. I would not necessarily pick the adjective "easy" to describe Japan in my list of first 5 adjectives, but I will agree with you that in terms of the Kishida administration that is in place now. We are creating momentum in terms of our work. So I think really both on a bilateral basis, we at USTR have begun a new bilateral trade communication channel with Japan to address our bilateral issues. We have a trilateral discussion and forum that we have reignited with Japan and the EU on new subsidies rules and also new tools for addressing the challenges that we face in this 21st century. And also we look forward to working with Japan in a very robust way in the Indo-Pacific economic framework.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy is recognized.
Madam Ambassador, thank you for being here. Madam Ambassador, thank you for being here. First, as context, and this will be along the lines of what we've discussed in the past, if we have a problematic trading partner, say China, who is able to lower their price by noncompliance with environmental and labor regulations, that gives them an advantage not just to us, but to a country like Mexico or Guatemala who must comply with those by treaty with us. And every time we enforce that upon them, we raise their price relative to that in China, which then grows stronger and pollutes even more. I think you're with me on that. So in your opening remarks, you mentioned that we need new domestic tools. And in your and in the press releases regards the U.S.-EU agreement upon aluminum and steel, there is a suggestion that you might have a new domestic tool looking at the carbon content of the products that are being based. By the way, it occurs to me that we put barriers and penalties upon China. They promise that they'll change their behavior, so we relax those barriers and penalties. Then they don't comply, and then we have to enforce. But that's a different if you establish a standard which they must reach in order to have access to the market or by which to avoid the penalty. It's a different mechanism. It's less a promise and more if you don't comply, you pay a lot. So are these domestic tools of which you speak, including this kind of border carbon adjustment?
Senator Cassidy, I think in general my answer is yes, although I don't know I would describe it as a border carbon adjustment. But you're absolutely correct that the global steel arrangement that we are in the process of negotiating with the Europeans exactly does that, which is it is a mechanism for creating a market between the United States and the European Union that is going to ensure fair competition and the promotion of clean industries. And I agree with you in terms of the sense of leverage. Where you have a market gatekeeping mechanism as opposed to you open your market and are stuck having to increase barriers as a form of enforcement. It's a bit of a carrot and stick distinction.
Well, the nice thing about having the border carbon adjustment is it rewards our people who are doing the right thing and therefore paying a price, but then losing business because that business moves to a place where there's a lower cost of compliance. I want to stick up for my folks, and I think this is a way to do so. So we're very interested in partnering with you as you kind of develop these schemes. We've also spoken before regarding India's dumping of shrimp into the United States, and I'm told that they're pushing back hard on this. Can you give any update on that?
So this is something that I have spoken to you multiple times about. I know how important this is to you and your constituents. Secretary Raimondo and her team are in good conversation with mine around the dumping issue. And yes, I have raised this directly with my Indian counterpart in Delhi last November when I visited him. I did get very forceful pushback, but Senator Cassidy, I am committed to working with you on this issue, and that means in our own system, but that also means in engaging the Indian government, and look forward to exploring ways to do that.
I'm told they complain that we somehow put barriers on cold shrimp importation, but they don't have cold shrimp. And so if you don't have something, big deal. But it's their warm water shrimp that are heavily subsidized and perhaps don't meet phytosanitary standards. Similarly, they apparently heavily subsidize their rice from even before the seed is planted. and our folks are competing against something which is being sold below cost because of heavy subsidies. Is there any progress on addressing that?
We are looking at this issue carefully with our partners in the U.S. government. In terms of progress, let me get back to you since the last time I asked and make sure that you have the very latest.
Sounds great. Another concern we had that I had with Ambassador Lighthizer way back when, the absence of a dispute resolution for energy companies. It turned out that if your company was nationalized by Mexico, and you're directly contracting with the government, then you had some sort of appeal, but not if you were a subcontractor. Think of somebody required to build something there because of cabotage laws, then they could nationalize it and you would not have recourse. I gather that is currently taking place, and you addressed this as an earlier question, but just to explore. A group out of Houston has had their stuff nationalized. What are we going to do to push back against that sort of issue?
Well, I'm working with partners across the administration on this. This issue has the attention of many of us working in our different issue areas, from energy to trade to commerce and more, including climate. So I want to assure you that this has the attention of the Biden administration, and at USTR, we are looking at all the tools that we have to enforce what we know is in that agreement, but also to champion the cause of our stakeholders and North American competitiveness.
Thank you. I yield.
All right. There is lots going on here today, Ambassador Tai. My understanding is the good souls here have agreed that Senator Warren will go next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Brown. So let's start with some good news. Ambassador Tai, your approach to worker-centered trade policy is actually beginning to pay off. Thanks to your work, 2 large groups of employees in Mexico voted overwhelmingly for new unions. That is good for those workers, and it helps level the playing field for American workers who don't have to compete against overseas factories that are paying below poverty wages. But now the administration has announced plans to negotiate a new trade deal called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Lobbyists for the giant corporations are celebrating the IPEF as the second coming of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, there's a reason that the original TPP was derailed. It would have offshored more jobs to countries that use child labor and prison labor and pay workers almost nothing. Let me be clear. The IPEF cannot be TPP 2.0. Ambassador Tai, you will lead the negotiations on a key pillar of this new framework on fair and resilient trade. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo will lead the negotiations on several other pillars, and I urge the chairman to schedule a public hearing with her soon as well. But I want to ask you about your approach to these new negotiations. Ambassador Tai, you have included labor and climate as your 2 top areas of focus in these negotiations. Are you committed to including strong, enforceable commitments in these 2 areas in IPEF and extending trade benefits only to countries that can meet these standards?
Senator Warren, thank you so much for this question, and thank you for highlighting the objectives that we've put out, including in our Federal Register notice recently. The short answer is yes, and the reason why these 2 areas are listed at the top of our list is to indicate that in the exercise of setting high standards, that one of the areas where the United States has consistently led around the world has been in incorporating strong, enforceable labor and environment standards to demonstrate our commitment to the importance of these areas in our competitiveness and in our terms of trade.
Good. They're the right goals, and you're already proving we can make this work. You know, our trade policy for far too long has been about lowering standards so that giant corporations can increase profits. Let's raise standards and build more of these jobs at home. Now, I know that you're also going to be negotiating rules on the digital economy. Tech companies like Facebook and Amazon are a huge part of global trade, and they're also involved in spreading misinformation, mistreating workers, and squashing competition. They also hire hordes of lobbyists to protect their appalling way of doing business. Ambassador Tai, will you ensure that any new digital trade rules promote competition so they benefit workers, consumers, and small businesses, and not just a handful of big tech companies?
Well, Senator Warren, let me assure you that one of our guiding principles in all of our exercises, but in particular in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the digital pillar, the digital component of the trade pillar, is to ensure that our stakeholders' views are represented robustly and comprehensively, so that that table of advice and input is going to reflect our entire economy, not just parts of it.
I am very glad to hear that, and I very much appreciate your demonstrated commitment to labor, environmental, and competition standards. But frankly, I'm worried that these higher standards will only be included in the trade pillar that you are responsible for negotiating. Secretary Raimondo will lead the negotiations on the 3 other pillars. And when she listed her priorities, labor standards and competition were absent. Based on this and her other comments, I am concerned that her approach will boost profits for giant corporations, the ones that offshore jobs and squash small businesses. That should be a non-starter in our negotiations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Brown.
Thank you, and I
always standing up for workers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ambassador. It's wonderful to see you. It's I look at the chairman of this committee and the trade rep, and frankly, the last questioner, and I see the most pro-worker officials I've seen in this government in my time here as the chair of the Finance Committee, as Ambassador Tai. I commend the administration on the recent successes of USMCA in raising labor standards in Mexico through the use of the Brown, White, and Rapid Response Mechanism. Your leadership in lifting worker standards everywhere. We help what you say when we lift worker standards everywhere. We help American workers. That's what your predecessors never understood or never cared to understand. You do, and thank you for that. The President's 2022 trade policy agenda makes clear, as Senator Warren said, as Senator Wyden has said, this administration is taking a worker-centered approach to trade policy, as it always should have been. I know what bad trade policy has done. In my state, we've lived with the wreckage caused by a trade policy lobbied by corporate interest and where Congress and administrations went along that encouraged corporations to move products overseas in the name of efficiency, always efficiency, which I think is just business school speak for lower wages and more environmental pollution. You've taken a different approach. I am deeply indebted to you, and that's why I was thrilled with your confirmation a year plus ago. My question, a couple questions. In your testimony to Ways and Means, you said China is continuing to double down on unfair trade practices. You explained the administration will need to explore, quote, the design and build of new tools and strategic investments. I've called for those strategic investments in manufacturing and American industrial production for all my time in Washington, including, as part of the failed TPP effort. I'm glad you mentioned that yesterday. I know my colleague from Ohio brought up our bill, Leveling the Playing Field 2.0, which was included in the House Pass America Competes package. I'm depending on Senator Portman to help us keep it in this version. You spoke about how this could help strengthen endorsement. What other tools do we need to make good on the administration's commitment to supporting American workers?
Senator Brown, it's wonderful to see you, and thank you for your kind words. I also celebrate the wins and our demonstration of how a worker-centered trade policy can work and how we can do trade right. On new tools and strategic investments, let me just mention some of the efforts that are currently underway as extremely promising. Leveling the Playing Field 2.0, one of them, when I talked to Senator Portman about that, Frankly, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that was passed and signed into law at the end of last year is another example. The CHIPS legislation that has been proposed in both chambers. Let me just say that all of these components are critically important, necessary, but also not sufficient. And so I look forward to working with you and your colleagues here in the Senate and the House on building out our suite of tools, including keeping all of you informed and engaged and receiving input on exercises like the negotiation with the European Union on a global steel arrangement that will promote fair competition as well as clean industries.
Thank you, and very, very important to our country and to climate. So thank you. I have one other question, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring up what the chairman spoke about earlier on revoking permanent normal trade relations with Russia. We've been appalled, all of us, of course, well, almost all of us, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a moral imperative that we do every single thing we can. I know that the former vice president's daughter, Liz Cheney, a House member in Wyoming, talked about the Putin wing of the Republican Party. I'm hopeful that that's not represented in the Senate, but I'm not sure of that. But we do have agreement Russia should not have free and unlimited access to our economy or the global economy. The Senate has a chance to revoke PNTR with Russia. Senate Republicans keep blocking it, as you know. Every day that we let this stay on the books is another day we fail to support the Ukrainian people who have to live under the fire from this unprovoked imperialist Russian invasion. Could you speak to the importance of ending PNTR as the administration works to support Ukraine?
Senator Brown, I'd be pleased to. The swiftness of the coordinated actions between the United States, the European Union, and our other allies and partners on the issue of pushing back and creating real significant consequences for Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's violation of Ukrainian sovereignty has been a real achievement. I want to commend the members of Congress for speaking up very quickly and in a united way, on a bipartisan fashion, bicamerally, on the need to take PNTR away from Russia. That said, we're only halfway there, and we have said the words, but now we need to finish the act. It has been so important to have the United States government speaking in one voice, and I look forward to working with you and others to get this over the finish line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. I also very much appreciate your bringing up PNTR this morning, because this is the way, revoking PNTR, this is the way you deal a powerful body blow to Putin and the oligarchs. I mean, there were stunning reports, over the weekend that basically anybody who makes money in Russia is giving Putin a cut. These oligarchs have enormous influence, and we have got to get this PNTR passed. And then, as Senator Brown and I have talked about, I'd like to move on to another bill so that if American companies doing business in Russia and paying taxes to the Russian government, we ought to take away foreign tax credits, because there is no reason that people in Oregon and Ohio ought to be subsidizing the Putin war machine. So we've got to get this PNTR done. Then we can move on to other important issues, and I thank Senator Brown. All right, our next three in order are Senator Casey, Senator Daines, and Senator Warner, and I hope we can get all three of them done before the vote. Senator Casey, are you online? Senator Daines is here?
Yes.
Okay, Senator Casey, Senator Daines, and then Senator Warner. We're going to get them all done before the vote. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much, and I want to thank Ambassador Tai for coming to the hearing today and to being with us. I want to commend both you and the Biden-Harris administration for your critical work to promote worker-centric trade policy that lifts up our domestic production and our manufacturing capacities. As you know, Senator Cornyn and I have been working on a piece of legislation now for a good while, the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, which sets up a committee to review offshoring of critical U.S. supply chains. As the pandemic has demonstrated, we need to enhance visibility on supply chain vulnerabilities. This legislation, as you know, is also being led in the House by Representative Pascrell and as well as the United States Representative DeLauro. And I know you spoke in front of their committee yesterday talking about leaving, quote, no stone unturned. And you may have seen last week that Secretary Raimondo said publicly she would, quote, support enhancing our outbound investment screening. So here's the question: how would outbound investment screening add to and enhance existing tools and strategies to prevent further offshoring that threatens our national security, our domestic supply chains, as well as threatening U.S. workers and leaving us dependent upon foreign adversaries, especially China and Russia?
Senator Casey, it's a really important issue, and I know you and I have spoken directly about your bill. In terms of your question, I think that what is critical about this particular type of tool is that it is keeping pace with the challenges that we are facing and the risks that we are seeing in the competitive environment that our economy is in right now. So again, with respect to inbound screening, that is something where we have existing tools. As we are seeing new vulnerabilities arise in the outbound area, I think it is critical for us to be taking a look at tools like the one that you have proposed.
Thanks very much. And I wanted a final question for you would be on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I hope that as the administration develops the framework, that you take into account the decades of offshoring and unfair practices by these non-market economies that have left both our workers and our businesses at a competitive disadvantage. We need to ensure that our trade policy supports both safe and fair working conditions for workers across the globe. I know you understand that and believe that. I've been working on policies like the particular bill, the Women's Economic Empowerment and Trade Act, working with Senators Cortez Masto and Senator Menendez. As you know, the USMCA trade agreement included sweeping labor provisions, and we've seen the early success of the rapid response mechanism in supporting the workers' rights. So here's the question: how would USTR build on the lessons we've learned from past trade agreements and approaches to ensure that our trading partners are treating workers fairly in the future?
Senator Casey, I think that the United States is truly a global leader in this area as well, in terms of our trade practice and bringing our trade policies back to their roots, which is all about creating opportunities for all people. We are, I'd like you to know, getting very good pickup from our trading partners and at the World Trade Organization in trying to renew this principle that trade policies are intended to benefit our economies and the human components in our economies above all. So in terms of the mechanisms and the standards that we have in USMCA, they are really at the cutting edge of international practice. We are looking forward to building on what we've already accomplished in the USMCA, and that is a guiding principle for our work across the board.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Next is Senator Daines and Senator Warner.
Ambassador Tai, welcome. Good to have you here. As I think about Montana, certainly reducing these unfair barriers to trade are so important for our farmers, our ranchers, our small businesses, so we can compete on this level playing field. 95% of the world's consumers are outside the United States. That's a lot of mouths to feed, and with the importance of being able to engage in those markets is critical for Montana, for U.S. jobs, for economic growth. It's especially true given China's growing economic and geopolitical influence in Asia-Pacific and around the world. Regarding China, Despite growth in exports for some commodities, it's pretty clear that China has not been meeting its agricultural purchasing or intellectual property commitments in that Phase 1 agreement. I was there in Beijing in 2019 working to get that Phase 1 agreement finalized, and we want to hold both sides accountable to make sure that we're living up to what we agreed to. So could you tell me what is the latest on any negotiations with your Chinese counterparts on that Phase 1 deal, and how are you working to enforce both the ag and the IP provisions of the agreement?
Well, Senator Daines, I know that your experience with respect to China runs very deep, and you understand both the opportunities and also the significant challenges that we have coexisting with China in the global economy. We, as the Biden administration, thought it was very, very important to begin our bilateral engagement with China on that Phase 1 agreement and the commitments that China made to the U.S. government and to U.S. stakeholders in that agreement. And that's why we have spent the past couple months focused in our conversation with China on two aspects. One is China's performance in view of the promises that it made in that agreement, especially with respect to its purchase commitments, which mean so much to our farmers and our ranchers and our agricultural producers. We have fought very, very hard to secure accommodations from China for the shortfalls that are apparent in the trade data. So far, as I've noted, the conversations have been very difficult. We're not going to close the door on those conversations. Nevertheless, we do need to move to a new phase of our engagement, and that includes looking more intensively at the overall industrial policy.
Let me ask you this. What confidence do you have if we're not willing to get better compliance on the Phase 1 deal? Why would that give you confidence we'll do better here on another deal?
I think that we're not necessarily looking at another deal in the next phase, but expanding out our focus on China's challenges beyond its commitments and compliance in Phase 1 to the issues that were not captured by Phase 1 or the original investigation on intellectual property and forced technology transfer to industrial targeting practices, where we have seen China again and again corner the market in critical industries and now increasingly in future industries.
Thank you. I want to talk about another important country, that's India. Late last fall, I traveled to India. I met Commerce Minister Goyal to advocate for reducing tariffs on Montana and U.S. ag. We talked a lot about Pulse, and to see firsthand some of the leading technology companies. That was down in Bangalore. It was Delhi and Bangalore is where we spent some time. It's clear that the coming years, India is going to play an even larger role in the region. And while it won't be easy, the U.S., I think, should consider entering formal negotiations with India, which presents an enormous opportunity for growth for the U.S. farmers, especially a state like Montana that is the #1 producer of pulse crops, India the #1 consumer. What is USTR doing for the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum or otherwise to address these long-standing agricultural market access issues? It's not a new problem that we've had with India, and particularly related to pulse crops.
So I heard about your visit also from Minister Goyal, who is very, very charismatic and also a very strong advocate for his country's policies. Some of which I think we will be able to strategically align with, and some of which will and have proven to continue to be challenging for us. It was very important for us as USTR and for me personally to go to Delhi to revive that trade policy forum. As a result of the trade policy forum, we secured commitments from India to open up trade for the first time or to resume trade in a number of areas. The one that has been delivered on soonest has been access for U.S. pork and pork products into India. We will continue to build on this relationship, which is so strategically important, but also has traditionally been quite challenging. And I want to thank you for making that trip to India. That kind of tag teaming is really critical, and I look forward to continuing to be able to do that with you with respect to India and other trading partners.
Master Tai, thank you. I just want to conclude by saying I echo some of my colleagues' frustrations with the lack of a chief ag negotiator at USTR. While we have you here, I just want to make sure you hear my frustration as well, which I think can hinder some of these efforts to go forward. This chief ag negotiator is such an important role for ag-producing states like Montana. It's the number one economic driver. And the fact we're well over 15 months in the administration and currently not even have a nominee to consider is unacceptable and, frankly, hurtful to our farmers and ranchers who at the time are battling high cost of fuel and high cost of fertilizer and drought.
Senator Daines, if I may quickly, the president has nominated someone, and we will nominate another person, and I commit to you on that today.
Time of the gentleman expired. Okay, Senator Warner is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador Tai, it's good to see you at least remotely, and I appreciate the chance that we had to meet in person recently. I want to start my questions in terms of discussing our country's trade relationships with Africa and first country specifically Ethiopia. I know the president made a determination that Ethiopia, because of some of the human rights and other circumstances, was being pushed out of AGOA. I'm concerned, I've got a very large Ethiopian diaspora community in Virginia, that as we do that, we do it carefully because the ramifications it will have for a lot of the Ethiopian civilians, for the economy, for civil society, and particularly in light of the fact that there has been progress made, that the government has reached some level of at least lifting the state of emergency and working with the Tigrayans to try to create some level of ceasefire. My hope is that we can improve our relationships with the Ethiopian government and, frankly, get Ethiopia back in to AGOA. Can you speak about that relationship, and has the recent progress on the ground in Ethiopia sped up any of this process?
Senator Warner, I'd be happy to comment here. I think that we've all been watching what's been happening in Ethiopia with a grave concern, and as a humanitarian issue, it's really heartbreaking to see what's happening in that country. The revocation of AGOA benefits is a result of the criteria and the AGOA program as it's written. We are following the latest developments in Ethiopia. We are very much encouraging the government and others in Ethiopia to continue to make progress. We have set out a very, very clear set of benchmarks for Ethiopia that will create its pathway back into AGOA. And on this, we are working not just as USTR, but with partners throughout the administration, including the Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, to support that pathway back.
Well, I would like to continue that conversation. I think the government in Addis has made significant strides forward. I think I want to make the humanitarian relationship with the Tigrayans. I think the lifting of the state of emergency are important. I want to try to get two more questions in. One, I want to raise the status of the negotiations with Kenya. Another opportunity, in Virginia, and I think in probably in many states around the country, fastest growing population in the Commonwealth is the African diaspora. And this is an incredibly talented asset we feel in Virginia, and increasing our trade with everywhere in Africa is a great opportunity. But I know U.S.-Kenyan trade conversations have been on your agenda, and if you can give me any update on that, that'd be great.
Yes, I'd be happy to provide you an update. I believe it's this week, and if it's not this week, it'll be next week. The head of my African Affairs office is leading a delegation to Nairobi to continue to engage with our counterparts in the Kenyan government around trade enhancements that we can work on. And we've exchanged a set of ideas back and forth, and I will be happy to report back and have my team report back to yours on that trip as soon as they're back.
And on my last comment, in my last minute, and this is respectfully an area that the chairman and I have had some disagreements on, but I want to raise it with you, and that is the growing debate in our Congress about reforms to Section 230 around the Communications Act and the protections that provides to many of our social media companies. I was concerned when Section 230 protections were included in USMCA. And while there's a great amount of debate on this issue, I hope we can have that fulsome debate here and don't individually include Section 230 protections on other future trade agreements when I think there's a growing bipartisan consensus here in the Congress that we need to reform Section 230. So I won't ask for a comment on that, but I'll look forward to continuing working with you and with the chairman on this issue.
And Ambassador, because I feel very strongly that approach would be a mistake for America and a mistake for the world. Senator Warner and I will continue this debate offline because we've got lots of members ready to ask questions. I just want to repeat how strongly I feel about it, and we'll be talking about that. Okay, next is Senator Whitehouse and then Senator Barrasso.
Thanks, Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse, you're there, and then Senator Barrasso.
I am here. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Tai. Ambassador, I'd like to ask you a few questions about the Indo-Pacific framework on specific issues. And I have 4 different areas, and they are some fairly complex. So I hope that you'll feel free to, given that I have 4.5 minutes now, take this as a question for the record and have your team get back to me. And I would hope by a set date, so it's not just an unknown obligation to answer. The first has to do with ocean plastic waste. Scientific American has reported that 10 rivers contribute about 1/4 of all the ocean plastic waste, and 8 of those rivers are in Asia. So getting agreements to deal with the ocean plastic waste problem in the Indo-Pac framework would seem to me to be a very important priority. That's 1. 2 is predatory Chinese fishing, which is a problem around the world, but particularly throughout Asia. I traveled extensively throughout Asia with Senator McCain, and in every Asian coastal country that we visited, there was very strong resentment about the way the Chinese fishing fleet, often supported by the Chinese Navy, was treating their sovereign fisheries. I think this is actually an issue that really goes around the world, but particularly in this Indo-Pacific framework, I would be interested in what you're doing on both Chinese predatory fishing practices and more generally pirate fishing, what is called IUU fishing, illegal fishing. So that's 2. The third is climate. I'm not sure what you're looking at for climate provisions in the framework, but we're obviously facing a huge crisis, and particularly the sea level impacted areas of the Pacific are going to be crises in the future as they get overwhelmed by sea level rise. And unfortunately, in the not too distant future, it looks like for some of the major cities and even breadbaskets like the Delta in Vietnam. And the fourth is anti-kleptocracy. We have just seen played out in Ukraine what happens when fossil fuel funded kleptocrats can run their countries like dictators and destroy other nearby countries, or at least try to, using their military.
I think the Biden administration has wisely understood that kleptocracy is actually a national security issue, and that areas in which people hide money and are able to seek rule of law shelter for ill-gotten gains, we've got to clean up that mess. And wherever there's a leak, that's where the crooked kleptocrats' money will go. So it's really important to have agreements across the nations of the world that they will stop providing that kind of sanctuary to crooked, criminal, and corrupt money around the world. So you now have 1 minute and 15 seconds to answer on all of that. So it may be no more than I'll get you an answer by X date on each one, but I offer those 4 questions to you.
Senator Whitehouse, let me just say a couple words here, and we will get answers to you on the QFR schedule that Senator Wyden sets out. On all of the issues that you have identified, we are interested and intending to cover in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Many of them within the trade pillar. Anti-kleptocracy, I think, if we understand it generally as anti-corruption also, will be in a pillar that Secretary Raimondo is leading. I just want to emphasize that Secretary Raimondo and I have been working hand in glove on this economic framework, as have our teams, and that as we move forward into launch and into the discussions, we will continue that hand in glove partnership with each other, but also want to incorporate all of the priorities that you and other members of this committee have. So I look forward to doing that work with you.
Start strong, because things usually don't get stronger in negotiations. Thanks. My time is up.
Time of the gentleman's expired. Ambassador, I wasn't clear whether you wanted to answer today about 2:30 or send a response to the record. What is your pleasure?
I'd be happy to begin by responding today, Senator Wyden.
Very well.
To Senator Warner's question, which is we are at USTR very, very aware of the dynamics and the debate around this particular provision in U.S. law. And we will continue to follow it closely as we conduct our trade conversations.
Very, very good. We'll obviously work with you. My interest here is very much connected to the trade space. And that is 230 is all about the innovators. It's all about the risk takers. The big guys, they never have to worry. They can monetize any claims and the like. It's always about the people with the big new ideas. And what's striking is a lot of these platforms, when they were small, oh my goodness, they thought 230 was the greatest thing since night baseball was invented. But as they got big and powerful, they pulled up the moat to try to hold down the little guys and the innovators. We will have that conversation in the future. Thank you. Senator Brasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ambassador, nice to see you again. Thanks for your service. Thanks for taking time to meet with us today. You know, when we last met to discuss President Biden's trade agenda, I raised some concerns about a number of issues, and they included U.S. intellectual property rights protections, opening new markets to Wyoming's beef, soda ash, and energy, unfair Chinese trade practices, human rights violations, carbon border adjustments, World Trade Organization reform, and trade enforcement as well. And, you know, and after more than a year, the administration, I believe, failed to address any of these concerns that I have. Instead of protecting American intellectual property for COVID vaccines, the administration worked vigorously at the WTO to give this intellectual property away. And we've had that interaction, you and I, in this committee room about that. Instead of aggressively seeking new markets for American goods, President Biden's allowed our nation to fall behind. Last year, the trade deficit increased to an all-time high. From day one, the president made it clear that he wasn't really interested in negotiating new free trade agreements, and unfortunately, he's kept his word. Instead of prioritizing energy production at home so we can lower prices and increase exports to our friends, the president remains focused on shutting down U.S. energy production and exporting a wide array of liberal labor, social, and environmental policies instead. While America sits on the sidelines, China clearly is winning in this.
confrontation. This year, China signed the largest trade deal in history. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, encompasses 1/3 of the global GDP, 15 Indo-Pacific countries, and 53% of the world's exports. China understands the importance of not only market access, but also securing market share. So, the question I have for myself is, what is the Biden administration's solution? Is it an Indo-Pacific economic framework that fails to provide market access or increase market share for U.S. producers? Is it a series of pillars or modules that countries in the region may or may not voluntarily join? It's also not clear to me how the framework will help us counter our adversaries and our competitors, including China. My home state of Wyoming understands and appreciates that the importance of trade has been very important for us historically and presently. We need to work with our allies to exchange goods and services across resilient, reliable supply chains. We must lower tariff barriers and trade barriers. We must provide relief for families facing skyrocketing prices, supply constraints, a global pandemic. Look, Wyoming wants to strengthen our economy and create jobs, and the trade agenda falls way short of that. So given your wealth of experience in international trade, can you explain how an agenda that exports progressive ideas instead of American-made goods and services is going to help our country keep pace with China?
Well, Senator Barrasso, it's good to see you, and I know we've had some very good conversations in the past. I'm disappointed to hear that you don't think that we have been doing anything, because I can assure you that my commitment to the United States, our economy, our stakeholders, and our trade policy are absolute. I guess I'm trying to suss out the specific question that you have for me, which is what have we been doing?
And I want to know how we recover the market share that we've already lost without aggressively pursuing market access for U.S. producers.
I don't actually think that we have lost market share. And let me just take as an example your point about the RCEP, the RCEP. That is a trade agreement between 15 countries who already have multiple trade agreements between them. So I think that in the economic analysis of the impacts of the RCEP on the United States economy, I don't think that there are significant or detectable impacts, because it is kind of a remix and match of what is already there. But let me also just want to stick up for myself in terms of all of the work that we have been doing over the course of the past year. And it does include market opening. Over the previous years, there was a lot of market closing, if you will. And there was a reason for it. But we feel very strongly that our approach to trade needs to be more strategic. And the first year dealt with a lot of converting trade tensions that we had taken over into real wins for America, for our farmers, for our workers, and for our economy as a whole. I do want to focus on your interest in this question of market share, because it is something that we are looking at, specifically with respect to our competition in trade with China. And there I would say that with respect to steel and aluminum, with respect to solar panels, we have lost market share, but that is because of the negative impacts of China's policies on us. And that is an area where we are extremely motivated to act and to act along with the U.S. Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
The time of the gentleman has expired. We have the good fortune of having Senator Hassan here, very knowledgeable about trade issues. She'll close our hearing out. We may have a couple of other people maximum, but just a very quick close for you, Ambassador, and then I'm glad we have Senator Hassan here. Ambassador, you've made significant progress on key issues, and the past year has been a bit less chaotic, but no less challenging. You've had your hands full, and you've reduced tariffs on our exports to the EU. That is a good thing. And increased market access for our ag products, for example, to India. So your job's not for the faint-hearted. I'm really glad that you keep coming back to the importance of transparency and consultation. We heard a lot of members focus on that, and we look forward to working with you in the days ahead. Senator Hassan, for your comments, and probably one or two others coming back to close the hearing. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your and Ranking Member Crapo's decision to hold this hearing. And I want to thank you, Ambassador Tai, for testifying today and for all your work on behalf of the American people and American businesses. The United States has led our allies around the world in imposing crippling economic sanctions on Vladimir Putin and his cronies for Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. We have to ensure that Putin can't circumvent our sanctions, which is why Senator Cornyn and I are leading a bipartisan effort to close a loophole that allows Russia to prop up its economy by selling off its massive gold reserves. Ambassador, what tools does your office have available to help ensure that Russia does not evade any existing sanctions? And how can you continue to apply pressure on Putin for these unprovoked attacks?
Well, Senator Hassan, this is such an important issue and so extremely timely and responsive to the challenges that we're facing in the global economy. The most direct tool that we have in the trade toolbox is how we treat Russia at the WTO. Right. And the U.S. Congress has certainly spoken, and we have, in concert with our allies and our partners, made it very clear that Russia's behavior has disqualified it from the courtesies that we grant to our partners at the WTO. In terms of the circumvention concerns that you've raised, those are critical issues to how effective our sanctions will be. And I think that in terms of the largest sets of sanctions that are related to the financial system and export controls, we are happy to work with our lead partners at the Commerce Department and at the Treasury Department in whatever way that we can.
I appreciate that very much. This is a whole of, not only whole of government, it's a whole of country and whole of democracy's response. So thank you. I want to follow up with a question now about supply chain. Earlier this month, this committee held a hearing on outcompeting China by strengthening economic ties with our allies in the Indo-Pacific region. I spoke with witnesses about ways to increase our supply chain resiliency, including through legislation I've developed to help bring back American manufacturing in strategically critical sectors. Ambassador, how is your office working to increase the security of critical U.S. supply chains while also strengthening our alliances in the Indo-Pacific and beyond?
Well, this is really one of the critical issues that is before us and our trading partners right now, which is after pursuing decades of efficiency-first trade policies that were all about unfettered trade liberalization, what are we going to do today in the face of 2 years of a pandemic where lockdowns are continuing even now, and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is deeply disruptive to certain parts of our global trade. What are we going to do about our supply chain resilience? And in terms of USTR's role, we have been working in the interagency. This is a whole of government, whole of country effort. We lead a supply chain task force, which is looking at combinations of our trade tools, whether they are on the enforcement and defensive side or they are on the negotiation side, in terms of how we come together with our trading partners to help each other make each other stronger. How do we not just trade more, but trade smarter with each other? And we've had very, very good conversations, and I think that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is going to be a really critical forum for this type of collaboration and, frankly, innovative thinking in terms of our trade policies. It's not a problem we have solved for before, but it is really clear to all of us that the version of globalization that we have today is fragile and is reinforcing our insecurity. And we need to figure out how we can trade with each other in a smarter way. And I do want to reinforce where you started, which is it is about trade and it is also about rebuilding the U.S. manufacturing base.
Right. Thank you. I want to follow up on another important issue that we discussed at last year's Trade Agenda hearing regarding the small business chapter of the bipartisan U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. In addition to cutting red tape for small New Hampshire business exporting to Canada and Mexico, the agreement also created a committee to give the small business community a voice in shaping our trade policy. Can you update us on your office's efforts to be responsive to small business input regarding trade with Canada and Mexico?
I'd be happy to. I believe it was last October that we had actually a USMCA small business outreach event in Texas, I think San Antonio, but my team will correct me if I've gotten the wrong city.
Yeah.
The small business chapter is one of the clear wins of the USMCA,
Yep.
and I just want to reinforce for you that in our ongoing conversations, in our forward-looking conversations, we are carrying that small business record from USMCA into these new conversations because this is a critical part of democratizing trade, bringing our trade policies to our people and our communities.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I now will turn it over to Senator Cortez Masto if she's available virtually.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Chairman. Ambassador Tai, it's great to always see you. Thank you for joining us again. There's one thing we talk about, and I'm going to just bring it up with you again, and this is the aggressive tariffs on solar panels. Here's my concern, and I think from so many in the industry, is that with these aggressive tariffs, we are running the risk of actually undermining rapid solar deployment and risking our ability to achieve the president's climate goals. Right now in Nevada, I have 600 IBEW trained union workers ready to go to work this year, building a 300 megawatt solar project in Nevada, but it's at risk if they can't get the materials they need for construction. I also know the latest petition that has been presented to Commerce risks cutting off a supply of over 80% of the solar panels needed to build out the development of our clean energy economy and create good paying jobs and reach our climate goals. Now, I have raised this concern with Secretary Raimondo directly. We have sent letters in opposition. I've been joined by my colleague, Senator Rosen. Our concerns about this. Here it is in a nutshell. At the end of the day, I absolutely understand we need to grow solar manufacturing in this country, but we can't do it overnight. And if we are going to make sure we continue with the growth in the jobs and go down this clean energy path, we can't chill it by continuing these tariffs or these investigations that are happening that are going to prevent installers and others from moving forward towards this clean energy future. So here's my ask of you, just as to Secretary Raimondo, is how can you help us? Is there a path forward for resolving this issue so that we can support growing our domestic industry, holding countries like China accountable, but without putting critical clean energy projects and workers in my state and across the state with putting their jobs on the line?
Senator Cortez Masto, I know your views on this, and I know the impacts to the community that you represent in Nevada. Let me try to respond to your direct question in this way. I think that we do have the tools to thread this needle where we need to rebuild our manufacturing capacity here at home, but also be able to deploy this available technology and support jobs in both parts of this sector. I will be the first one to admit that trade tools are powerful, but they have their limitations in bringing about the policy change that we need and need to be deployed in combination with other policies. And I know that there are legislative initiatives as well to address some of these issues, and want to let you know that we are very interested in ensuring that our trade policies can work in concert with other policies to better support all parts of our economy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate that, and I look forward to both working with you and Secretary Raimondo. I also, let me just say this on a separate subject. I understand Senator Casey already talked to you about the Women's Economic Empowerment and Trade Act that he and I both worked together on. Thank you. Thank you for the good work you're doing there and your support of that legislation. Then finally, let me just jump to workers' rights. On March 2nd, the USTR released both its 4-year strategic plan as well as its 2022 trade policy agenda and 2021 annual report to Congress. Both focus on pursuing a worker-centric trade policy and standing up for workers' rights. So, Ambassador, can you discuss how you plan to implement these policies and talk a little bit about them?
Certainly. Senator Cortez Masto, we have been implementing the policy already now for more than a year, and let me talk a little bit, give you some examples of our wins there, and talk a little bit about where we want to take this. So the worker-centered trade policy is about taking a new approach to our trade policies where we are championing not just the biggest economic stakeholders and the biggest winners in our economy, but also bringing trade policy back to regular people and the communities in which they live. Our approach to resolving the 17-year-long dispute with the European Union on large civil aircraft is an example of bringing the spirit of worker-centrism to our trade policy. We worked with not just our aircraft maker and its suppliers, but also with the machinists who work for those companies as we negotiated the agreement with the European Union and the United Kingdom, so that when we got to the outcome, it is an outcome that reflects not just the interests of one part of our economy, but all parts. In this case, that agreement also led to the lifting of tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic, which we feel strongly further championed the interests of large segments of our economy. So the spirit of worker-centrism is one around uniting as much as possible American economic interests, including those of our people, behind what we do in trade. And we're very excited to build on our record from the first year and do more in our second year.
Ambassador, thank you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. I believe, Senator Bennett, you are out there in cyberspace somewhere.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I'm going to just interject for a minute. Because of the timing of votes and the timing of this hearing, Senator Bennett, I'm going to turn over the gavel to you virtually, and you will ask your questions and close the hearing out, which we have checked with the knowledgeable people in the room is okay. And I'm going to go back and vote. And Ambassador, thank you so much.
That's bad news for Ambassador Tai because I've got about an hour's worth of questions for her. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Ambassador Tai, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you for testifying before the committee today. I want to also lend my voice to underscore the need to nominate and confirm a chief agricultural negotiator. I am hearing from Colorado farmers about their concerns on high input costs and regulatory challenges they're facing in international markets, and they need a permanent chief trade advocate for them here in Washington. Moving to the questions, I'm concerned that for years across Democratic and Republican administrations, we have neglected to implement a coherent strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. You and I have talked about that before, and instead, China has expanded its influence in that region and the world, including across Latin America, for example, in our own hemisphere. And I just wonder, in light of supply chain disruptions due to COVID and ongoing global instability, whether you see potential opportunities to reshore critical supply chains to the U.S., what you can say about our opportunities to strengthen partnerships across the Western Hemisphere through trade that might also give us a greater chance of strengthening those supply chains, and what challenges you think we face in reshoring or even nearshoring critical industries, and how Congress could help reduce any barriers there.
Senator Bennett, this is such a critical question. I think that one of the greatest barriers that we face is that we require new thinking And new thinking is often met with fear, but then also sometimes just met quizzically. And so I think that the first barrier is bringing innovation to our trading partners around how we accomplish resiliency through trade. I've spoken a little bit about this, but our traditional trade policies have been about maximizing liberalization and creating incentives for efficiency for our firms. I think that our experience shows us that where we are today, we need to look for resilience. We need to look for ways to reestablish a sense of security and confidence in the global economy. And I think that that will be done through a combination of rebuilding a manufacturing base here in the United States and establishing trusted and strategic trade relationships with our partners and our friends.
I would like very much the opportunity, if you've got somebody who's doing some of that new thinking, to talk to them about it, because I do think this is a moment where, you know, we're realizing that prioritizing making stuff as cheaply as possible in China versus, as you say, resilience or the chance to make things here in the United States, our own national security. And there are all kinds of other values that I think our trade policy ought to reflect. Let me just quickly, in the last 2 minutes that I have, Ambassador, shift gears slightly. In your testimony, you state that the administration relaunched the United States-India Trade Policy Forum. I know that's come up this morning, but I didn't have the chance to hear it. India has been a critical U.S. ally. I'm deeply concerned about the status and trajectory of our relationship with India, especially in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and India's reluctance to condemn what Vladimir Putin has done. Could you elaborate on the progress of that forum and discuss any challenges we face and how our trade policy can strengthen our partnership with India? And then I will let you go.
Thank you, Senator Bennett. With respect to India, India is such an important trade partner and a strategic partner. India is complicated, and we live in a complicated world. It was extremely important for us in the Biden administration to restart that trade policy forum with India and to do it at the ministerial level. So I went to Delhi last November to meet with my counterpart, Minister Goyal, and it was the first time in 4 years that the TPF had met at all. And the last time it met in 2017, it was so fraught that the two sides did not even issue a joint statement. This time we issued a joint statement that was really robust, around 5 pages, I think, and included important principles where we agreed to work together, as well as market access commitments that we have made to each other. So I think that this will continue to be a complicated relationship, but to your point, it is an extremely important one, and one where we need to continue to invest our dedication and our ability to make breakthroughs.
Thank you for that, and on behalf of the committee, thank you for your testimony today, Ambassador Tai. This hearing is adjourned.